My name is Leon Graves, and this is the Inkpath. In Part 1, we followed the story of Leon Mertens, a 23-year-old engineering student who collapsed after lunch at his factory job. There were no wounds, no signs of struggle, just one strange detail, a metallic taste in his mouth, and a body that was slowly shutting down. Weeks later, doctors confirmed the cause, mercury poisoning. But who did it? And how? No evidence? No suspects. The case went cold. But now, 2 years later, in that same break room, another factory worker opens his lunch and notices a fine layer of white dust on his sandwich. No smell, no source, no explanation. In Part 2, we return to the place where it all began, where a forgotten room may finally reveal the face of a killer. Let's get into it. Chapter 5. Back to the Factory. The chain unravels. I remember it was a Wednesday. A cold May wind slipped through the cracked window panes of the factory where Dietmar used to work. The walls were stained with faded paint, the wall clock ticked out of sync, and the break room lights flickered dimly, the kind of room people entered only to leave as quickly as possible. 2 years since the day Leon Mertens collapsed, and nothing had changed. But inside that same break room, the first cracks of truth began to show, in the most unexpected way.
The first time I noticed that white powder on my sausage sandwich, I thought maybe it came off the sleeve of my work shirt. Who would have guessed? That stuff nearly killed me.
Noah was a new mechanic, young, quick-witted. He started having stomach pain in mid-April, sharp cramps, cold sweats, rapid heartbeat. At first, like everyone else at the plant, he kept quiet. Complaining got you nowhere here. They even had a nickname for it, the plastic plant effect. Everyone who lasted more than a year eventually grabbed their gut. But this time, something was different. In May 2018, during a routine lunch break, Noah opened his sandwich and froze. Right along the edge of the cold-cut meat was a faint dusting of off-white powder, pale, slightly iridescent under the ceiling light. No smell, didn't dissolve when wiped. And there was no reason that powder should have been there, especially not in a locked lunchbox. His locker was sealed with a combination. Something didn't feel right. He slid the sandwich into a plastic bag and brought it straight to security. He demanded they file an official incident report. That sort of thing almost never happened at the factory, not in a culture where silence kept things running. Less than 24 hours later, the police returned. Authorities immediately reviewed who had access to the locker area. They cross-checked Noah's symptoms with Rainer's health records, a man who was now receiving dialysis 3 times a week. The similarities were striking. Under the supervision of a specialized task force from Bielefeld, a covert search warrant was quietly approved for a man who once shared that cursed break room, Dietmar Dahler, 48 hours later. At 5:37 a.m. on a Friday, they knocked on his door. His house sat beneath a quiet ridge outside Detmold. From the outside, it looked disturbingly normal. Trimmed lawn, spotless windows, not a speck on the welcome mat. But the basement was a nightmare. Bathed in the pale blue light of overhead halogen bulbs, the space resembled a brutalist parody of a university lab. A single metal table with one chair crusted with solid mercury along the edge. Dozens of reused plastic jars, from cherry jam to condensed milk, all with the labels scratched off. Notebooks scrawled in messy technical German, crammed with inorganic chemistry equations. A specimen cabinet, each vial labeled meticulously. Versuch 11, Mischung, Blei, CD, 2016 Woche 35. Test 11, Lead, Cadmium, Mixture, Week 35, 2016.
No civilian lab, not even in defense institutes, is allowed to store 4 toxic agents simultaneously: inorganic mercury, pure lead, arsenic, and powdered cadmium. Testing these on a living nervous system without killing the subject is cruelty on a level we usually only see in war crimes.
And that's exactly what Dietmar had done. With Leon Mertens, he injected mercury into Leon's lactose-free milk, through a pinhole in the carton, resealed without a trace. With Rainer, he used a slower, sustained method, a long-term dosage experiment, as he called it in his notes. Rainer was poisoned with a lead-cadmium mix. With Noah, it looked like Dietmar was testing a new formula, but Noah's suspicion ended the cycle before it could continue. One torn page, tucked behind the lab notebook, read, "Was bewegt den Mensch, der keine Furcht spürt?" What drives a man who feels no fear? No signature, no date. Maybe it was Dietmar's. Maybe it wasn't. Maybe he was asking himself. After 2 years, the thread finally snapped. Dietmar was arrested that very morning. The break room, where it all began, now bore a bold red notice. Staff must inspect all food and drink for contamination. Do not leave personal meals unlocked. Under the flickering light, a copy of Dietmar's old employee badge now hung with a stamped label, "Terminated." A silent mockery of the past. Because from the beginning, he never wanted to keep this secret. He only needed everyone else to be too normal to notice they were his test subjects. And Leon Mertens, poor, hopeful Leon, was just test subject number 1. Chapter 6. The Killer Compounds. I met Ruth, Dietmar's only cousin, on a misty early autumn afternoon in Detmold, just beyond a row of ancient pine trees behind the town. She sat quietly with a cup of unsweetened chamomile tea, eyes distant, voice brittle. "Our family. We always thought Dietmar was just different," she said. "Not a monster." She handed me an old photograph, Dietmar, buzzcut, grinning beside his father at a high school science fair. In that image, no one could have imagined that the same hand raising a soda that day would one day mix chemicals more brutal than battlefield weapons. Dietmar's basement, to call it plainly, was a death lab. After the raid on the morning of May 25, 2018, the space was immediately sealed off and handed over to a special team from the State Forensics Institute of North Rhine-Westphalia. What they found made the entire unit fall silent. Metallic mercury, the kind that can kill with just a few milligrams through inhalation or skin contact. Elemental lead, a neurotoxin capable of long-term brain damage when dosed gradually. Powdered cadmium, directly linked to kidney failure, bone degeneration, and cancer. And inorganic arsenic, once known in medieval times as the king of poisons.
That basement was the intersection of perverse obsession and advanced scientific knowledge. Not just anyone can isolate mercury compounds and synthesize dimethylmercury manually to slip into food. That level of understanding and that level of detachment is chilling.
In the internal investigation, the first hard clue pointing to intentional poisoning was confirmed. The lactose-free milk carton used by Leon Mertens on the day his symptoms began had a micro-puncture along the side, resealed with industrial-grade polymer glue. This detail only came to light after a full forensic sweep of the break room, including DNA tracing. Newly installed security cameras helped reconstruct Dietmar's movements. He often arrived early for his shift, uniform crisp, coat hung neatly on the same chair Rainer used. For 6 minutes, while the others remained on the line, he had uninterrupted access to the locker area, the food shelf, and the shared refrigerator. Traces of inorganic mercury were found forming a metallic ring near the carton's neck. Oral exposure likelihood greater than 90%. Victim's blood mercury level, 210 micrograms per liter. Critical threshold begins at 50. The cruelest part? None of this was meant to kill immediately. Dietmar kept meticulous logs in his notebooks, documenting the reactions of each test subject, referenced only by codes, time units, symptoms, and planned redosing schedules. Rainer, for example, never even knew he was being poisoned. Lead levels rose steadily in his kidney tissue. Cadmium settled in his liver, small amounts, but enough for long-term damage. To Dietmar, this wasn't just murder. This was biological measurement. Sample number 1F, total degradation. Meningeal rupture, week 3. Probable spinal cord degeneration, week 4. Pain response diminished after week 5. Recommend dosage increase for sample number 2-0. Even more disturbing was what he planned for Noah. On paper, Noah wasn't even at a lethal stage, just an early sensory exposure target. But the moment he opened that sandwich, before the lead powder had time to seep through the meat fat, he unknowingly saved his life and revealed everything. At the 2019 trial, when prosecutors asked Dietmar about his motive, he said nothing. No smile, no tears, no excuses. Finally, the judge asked one last question. Why? Dietmar's only reply, they weren't more important than the experiment. What drives someone to poison their coworkers? A failed dream of becoming a doctor? An inflated ego? Or a curiosity so deranged, so divorced from humanity, it sees people as samples? No sentence could bring back Leon Mertens, the engineering student who just needed a summer job. No measure could erase the quiet suffering of Rainer or Noah. All we know is this: if it hadn't been for that faint yellow light in the break room, if Noah hadn't noticed that strange, dusty shimmer, dozens more could have become subjects in Dietmar's nightmare ledger. And the truth would have been buried forever beneath layers of lead and scribbled, shaking handwriting in a frozen basement. What drives a man who feels no fear? Maybe only Dietmar knows, but now he's chosen silence, forever. Chapter 7. A Tragedy Without Answers. Every time Martina visited her son, Leon Mertens, at the Neurological Care Center in Bielefeld, she brought along a small notebook. Inside were short diary entries, quiet messages to a son who had never opened his eyes again. "It's raining today. I found you a new British mystery novel. You'd love it." Or sometimes just, "Your thesis advisor still asks how you're doing." 3 years. For 3 years, Leon existed like a tree ripped from its soil, still, pale, silent, in a hospital bed with wheels. His eyes stayed shut. The monitor blinked softly with each solitary heartbeat, proof that life remained. But whether his soul did, no one could say. Leon Mertens' funeral took place on the winter solstice, the darkest day of the year. It had been 10 months since Dietmar was sentenced to life in prison at the criminal court in Düsseldorf. But for Leon's parents, no amount of time would ever be enough. The pale wooden coffin didn't bear birth or death dates, only 3 carved words, "Taken from us." Questions about Dietmar's motive still lingered in forensic psychology lectures and weekend news specials. Why did he do it? Money? There was none. Revenge? No evidence. In every interrogation at Hochfeld prison, Dietmar said nothing. No denial, no admission. His eyes remained dry even as the court described the 36 months of suffering Leon endured. He bowed his head just once, when his cousin Ruth was mentioned. She was the only one who had visited him since the arrest.
I used to dream he'd wake up, squeeze my hand, and ask, "Mom, who is Dietmar?" But even I had to admit, I didn't have an answer. Some evil isn't born of hatred. It simply exists.
When the case was added to the University of Berlin's forensic curriculum under the codename Code HG3, curious students visited the hospital. They asked Dr. Kleber, the toxicologist who analyzed Dietmar's lab, if there had been any warning signs. He simply shook his head. He brought lunch on time, wrote emails with perfect grammar, made coffee for the maintenance crew. No one looked at him and thought, "This man is killing people with lab equipment." That line was quoted word for word in a cross-department scientific report, alongside a chilling conclusion. Traditional employee monitoring systems are inadequate to detect behaviors masked by technical knowledge and prolonged silence.
Science needs those willing to go first. Emotion only slows progress. I just wanted to see how far a human being like you could go.
If you'd flipped to the very last page of Dietmar's basement notebook, you might have missed it. Written in red ink, hands visibly unsteady. No data, no formulas, just 7 words. "I am nature's margin of error." To Rainer, now dependent on dialysis for the rest of his life, that margin of error feels like a survival curse. To Noah, who narrowly escaped death thanks to a few specks of lead dust that hadn't yet soaked into his sandwich, it's a twist of fate, saved by an ordinary glance during an otherwise ordinary lunch break. But to Leon Mertens, a final-year engineering student, a boy with oil-stained hands and a dream of opening his own garage, his story ended with the first carton of milk tainted with mercury. The reason why may never come. And sometimes that's the most terrifying part. As I walked away from the Rita Wiedenbrück cemetery that winter afternoon, the last sunlight caught the corner of Leon's gravestone. In the photo, he's outside the factory, grease on his hands, a smile on his face. Etched beneath his picture were the words, "People don't die because they're hated. Sometimes they just stand in the wrong place." And Martina's voice still echoed in my mind as I reached the car. What's frightening isn't death. It's living with a question no one wants to answer. Chapter 8. A Tragedy Without Closure. Leon Mertens died on a cold winter afternoon, just as the snow began to melt in northern Germany. Gray winds swept across Bielefeld, rattling the funeral home's roof, as if even the last memories had begun to curl from the chill. In the hallway outside the respiratory ICU, where Leon had been cared for over the past 3 years, a nurse finishing her final shift held on to a quiet ritual. Every evening, she folded a small towel and placed it gently beside his pillow, as if the young man might wake up at any moment, needing to wipe the sweat from his brow.
I used to imagine, if he opened his eyes, the first thing he'd say would be, "Why am I here?" And who would have the courage to tell him, "Because someone poisoned your life," with a smile that didn't mean anything.
After the 2019 trial, the public hoped Dietmar would confess, or at least reveal a sliver of truth buried beneath layers of chemical formulas from his basement. But he said nothing. No apology, no emotion. At Hochfeld Prison, psychologists described him as an emotional sponge, soaking up everything but never releasing a drop. When asked if he felt remorse, Dietmar smiled faintly and turned to stare at the officer's wristwatch. The life sentence brought no satisfaction, not to Leon's family. They didn't want punishment. They just wanted to know why. But that question remained unanswered, like a ribbon of mercury seeping silently across the floor, untouchable. Ironically, the case became academic material. Lecture slides, conference panels. At Charité University in Berlin, Case HG3 was used as a rare example of perfectly disguised chemical crime. But there, in one session, the forensic professor, the same man who had analyzed Dietmar's lab samples, visibly flinched as he reached slide 93, a photo of a napkin inside Rainer's lunchbox, where Dietmar had once sprinkled lead compound with surgical precision.
The horror in this case wasn't just the chemicals, it was the way they were used, without empathy, without hesitation, as if that man had never felt anything in his life.
Leon's notebook still rests with his mother. Each year on his birthday, she writes one more entry. This year, you would have been 26. Your friends are all working now, but none of them could fix an engine like you. The book is stitched in denim, cut from the old jacket Leon wore on his way to work. Every afternoon, he would march into the factory with his helmet in one hand, water bottle in the other, grinning wide. He had no idea that place, seemingly ordinary, was home to a man who saw his co-workers as human test subjects. Rainer, who now survives with the help of artificial dialysis, spends his remaining years in a quiet flat on the city's edge. His walls are filled with reminders of Dietmar, photocopied toxicology reports, an unsent letter of warning, and one red sentence he scribbled on the corner of an old lab result. We used to eat together. Noah, the man who spotted the fatal dust, now gives speeches at European workplace safety summits. But once, midway through, saying, "Pay attention to the silence of the people you don't understand." His voice cracked. He looked down and whispered, "I didn't know that silence was the sound of someone about to die." Leon Mertens' gravestone, nestled in the black granite of Rita Wiedenbrück Cemetery, shows him mid-action, removing a lug nut from a car wheel, grease in his hair, a cheeky smile on his face. Beneath the photo, his family later engraved a final message. Some endings don't come from fate. They come from someone wondering how far a human can be pushed. The day I left the cemetery, I saw Martina, still sitting beside his grave, her fingers tracing the etched letters, her eyes no longer crying. She turned to me, voice heavy, like waking from a long dream. "He wanted to open a little garage one day. Call it Felix Autowerk, Leon Mertens' workshop. If only he hadn't taken one sip of milk from his own carton, maybe that Christmas would have been warmer. I didn't know what to say, because in stories like this, the scariest part isn't the loss, it's the details that never quite fit, the ordinary moments, and the evil buried inside them, like a fleck of mercury, a trace of lead, or just silence. Leon Mertens never became an engineer. He became a warning about the people who sit beside us, who eat the same lunch, and who are never truly seen. The most chilling thing may not be a death sentence, but realizing that evil doesn't need a reason. It only needs the right conditions. Thank you for watching. If you've made it this far, you now know more than most people ever will about what happened in that break room. But the story isn't over. There's still the basement, the notebooks, and the one question no one can answer. Why? Subscribe to the Inkpath if you haven't already, and don't miss what comes next. New episodes every Tuesday and Friday. I'm Leon Graves. I'll see you in the next one.